testimony for political reasons. Were it not done so, we would not complain about it. This is a decent bill, which moves us in a step forward to try and control our spending habit, dealing with what is really the core issues and the core responsibility of our agencies, and trying not to harm people. I reserve the balance of my time.
Utah reserves. The lady from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I have no further requests for time. May I inquire of my colleague if he has further speakers?
Inquire of how much time actually remains.
The gentleman from Utah has 11 minutes, and the lady from New York has 9 minutes remaining.
To the gentlelady from New York, I have a brilliant 11-minute speech welling within my bosom. But I will be willing, if you're willing to close, I'll be willing to close as well.
I thank you for that, and I am willing to close. And let me just close with
Lady
this.
from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I think we have demonstrated that this bill contains an astonishing array of devastating cuts and special interest riders that jeopardize the water we drink, the air we breathe, and our country's national heritage. I urge a no vote on the rule and the underlying legislation and yield back the balance of my time.
The lady from New York yields back. The gentleman from Utah.
Mr. Speaker, I think we've also proved in this bill that we're moving in the right direction to try and control the excesses that continuously take place here and still maintain the core responsibilities that have to be there, and we have done it in a rule that is adamantly fair. It is an open rule that will allow anyone to bring anything down here to the floor until we do a UC agreement that stops it. It's a good rule. I urge your adoption of that particular rule. In closing, I will once again reiterate the fairness of this open rule. I urge its adoption. I urge the adoption of the underlying legislation, and with that, I yield back the balance of my time, and I move the previous question on the resolution.
All time having been yielded back without objection, the previous question is ordered. The question is on the adoption of the resolution. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The gentleman from Utah.
Oh, this hurts. I demand the yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. Those favoring a vote by the yeas and nays will rise. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this question are postponed. For what purpose does the lady from Illinois rise?
Mr. Speaker, I offered a privilege resolution and asked for its immediate consideration.
The clerk will report the resolution.
House Resolution 368, resolved that the clerk of the House of Representatives request the Senate to return to the House the bill H.R. 1309, entitled An Act to Extend the Authorization of the National Flood Insurance Program to achieve reforms to improve the financial integrity and stability of the program and to increase the role of private markets in the management of flood insurance risk and for other purposes.
Without objection, the resolution is agreed to and the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, proceedings now will resume on questions previously postponed as follows. First, adopting Resolution 363, and second, agreeing to the Speaker's approval of the Journal. First vote will be a 15-minute vote. The second vote will be a 5-minute vote.
That launches the first vote. Oh, I'm sorry. That does. I'm sorry. The first.
The Chair will make the following announcement. The Chair will remind the House that on July 24, 1998, at 3:40 p.m., Officer Jacob J. Chestnut and Detective John M. Gibson of the United States Capitol Police were killed in the line of duty defending the Capitol against an intruder armed with a gun. At 3:40 p.m. today, the Chair will recognize the anniversary of this tragedy by observing a moment of silence in their memory. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, proceedings will now resume. Adopting House Resolution 363, on which the yeas and nays were ordered. The clerk will report the title.
House Calendar Number 59, House Resolution 363, resolution providing for consideration of the bill H.R. 2584, making appropriations for the Department of the Interior, Environment, and related agencies for the fiscal year ending September 30th, 2012, and for other purposes.
The yeas and nays are ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 15-minute vote.
So the House is beginning legislative business with debate on the rule for Interior Department spending for fiscal year 2012. This is about $27.5 billion, and about 100 amendments are expected under the open rule. The budgets for the EPA, the National Park Service, the Smithsonian, and National Endowments for the Arts and Humanities are all included in this bill, along with other agencies. Vote on final passage may happen later this week. Members are also expected to debate extending the term of FBI Director Robert Mueller another 2 years. Senator Rand Paul had a hold on the nomination last week until he lifted it, with the Senate agreeing to the reappointment. So 2 votes right now during the series, a vote on the rule and a vote on the journal. A 15-minute vote followed by a 5-minute vote. House right now is voting on the rule for the Interior Department spending for fiscal year 2012. A vote on final passage could happen later this week. Members are also expected today to debate extending the term of FBI Director Robert Mueller another 2 years. The House is also expected to observe a moment of silence today in honor of the 2 Capitol police officers who were killed in the Capitol during an attack by a gunman in 1998. Detective John Gibson and Officer Jacob Chestnut were killed during that shooting. That tribute is expected to happen at about 3:40 this afternoon in the House. Also right now, House Democratic leaders are holding a briefing giving an update on the debt and deficit reduction negotiations on Capitol Hill. You can see live coverage of that. It's on our companion network, C-SPAN 3. It started about maybe 15 minutes ago. Again, that's live right now on C-SPAN 3. Correction. C-SPAN 2 right now, the debt and deficit reduction talks, and the update by House Democratic leaders is on C-SPAN 2.
On this vote, the yeas are 205, the nays are 131. Resolution is adopted. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, the unfinished business is the question on agreeing to the Speaker's approval of the journal, on which the yeas and nays were ordered. The question is on agreeing to the Speaker's approval of the journal. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 5-minute vote.
So the second of two votes in the House this afternoon, members wrapping up a vote on the rule for the Interior Department spending bill for fiscal year 2012. General debate on that is expected after this vote on the journal. Now, also on the agenda today, debate on extending the term of FBI Director Robert Mueller another 2 years. Mr. Mueller was nominated by President George W. Bush and became the 6th director of the FBI on September 4th of 2001. President Obama reappointed him for 2 years. This would be another 2-year extension. And the House is also expected to observe a moment of silence in honor of the 2 Capitol police officers who were killed in the Capitol during an attack by a gunman in 1998. Detective John Gibson and Officer Jacob Chestnut were killed during that shooting. That tribute expected at about 3:40 p.m. Eastern, when members will again observe a moment of silence.
On this vote, the yeas are 233, the noes are 108, with 2 members voting present. The journal stands approved. For what purpose? The House will be in order. The House will be in order. Members, please take your conversations off the floor. For what purpose does the gentleman from Idaho rise?
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on H.R. 2584, and that I may include tabular material on the same.
Without objection.
Pursuant to House Resolution 363 and Rule 18, the Chair declares the House in the Committee of the Whole on the State of the Union for the consideration of H.R. 2484. The Chair appoints the gentleman from California, Mr. Campbell, to preside over the Committee of the Whole. H.R. 2584.
The House is in the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for the consideration of H.R. 2584, which the clerk will report by title.
A bill making appropriations for the Department of the Interior, Environment, and related agencies for the fiscal year ending September 30th, 2012, and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the bill is considered read the first time. The gentleman from Idaho, Mr. Simpson, and the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Moran, each will control 30 minutes. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Idaho.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, or Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'm pleased to bring to the floor H.R. 2584, the fiscal year 2012 Interior, Environment, and Related Agencies Appropriation Bill. As we begin, I want to personally thank Mr. Moran, Mr. Dix, and each of the members of our subcommittee for their active participation in the bipartisan spirit that has been part of our deliberations this year. Regardless of our positions on this bill, I do sincerely appreciate their constructive contributions. Mr. Chairman, we're living at a time when the federal government borrows more than 40 cents on each dollar that it spends. We are also living at a time of record deficits and debt. While reductions in discretionary spending alone will not totally erase the deficit, we all know that reducing federal spending is a necessary first step. The fiscal year 2012 Interior and Environment Bill is funded at $27.5 billion, which is $2.1 billion, or 7% below the FY11 enacted level, and $3.8 billion, or 12% below the budget request. Overall funding within this bill is essentially level with fiscal year 2009 spending. The subcommittee has made some very difficult choices in preparing this budget proposal. In total, 235 members of the House submitted over 1,700 programmatic requests to the subcommittee for consideration. While the bill makes significant spending reductions across many agencies and programs, it also provides ample funding to address the needs of key accounts supported by a bipartisan cross-section of members. For instance, fire suppression at the Department of Interior and the Forest Service is fully funded at the 10-year average. The bill includes a $37 million increase over fiscal year 2011 for the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management to hire new inspectors and move forward with offshore oil and gas permitting and leasing while also improving safety. And members will be pleased to know that the operations of our national parks are sustained at levels only slightly below last year, which means every park unit in the country will be operational and fully staffed without the threat of furloughs or layoffs. Finally, this bill also makes critical investments in Indian country. Building upon efforts initiated by Mr. Dix and Mr. Moran, this bill continues to make investments in human health and wellness programs in Indian country affecting health care, education, and self-determination. Overall, the Department of Interior is funded at $9.9 billion, which is $715 million, or 7% reduction below last year's enacted level. As I mentioned, we've done some things that Secretary Salazar will support. The Secretary and I have had many discussions about these issues, as well as some areas where funding isn't what he would like to see. One of those areas relates to the funding of the Endangered Species Act. Since the ESA was enacted, there have been 2,018 species listed and only 21 recovered. By any calculation, that's a pretty poor track record. Any other program with such a poor rate of success would have long since been terminated. There isn't one member of this committee opposed to recovering endangered species, but the ESA has become so contentious, so political, and so litigious that it has become a policy failure. The authorization for the ESA appropriation expired 20 years ago, and the assumption has been that the Appropriations Committee would continue to fund it year in and year out as it has in the past. In fact, members might be interested to know that 26% of the funding in this bill is for programs in which the authorizations have expired. That's not how the process is supposed to work, Mr. Chairman, and just as we are going back to regular order and passing appropriation bills, we need to return to regular order when it comes to working with the authorizers to update and fix laws that no longer work or have expired. It's time to fix the ESA. The best way to do that is for the authorizers and stakeholders in the conservation community to come to the table to fix what is broken so we can actually begin recovering species. We are sending that message today. Climate change is another item of interest to members of this committee. Most of the members know that I'm not a climate change naysayer. The fact is that climate change funding has been increasing over the past few years, and no one has any idea how or whether its funding is being coordinated between various agencies. The GAO came to the same conclusion in a report released in May of this year. The GAO said, without further improvements in how climate change funding is defined and reported, strategic priorities are set, and funding is aligned with those priorities, it will be difficult for the public and Congress to fully understand how climate change funds are accounted for and how they are spent. As a result of this ongoing concern, climate change funding in this bill is reduced by $83 million or 22%. The bill also makes significant reductions in funding for land acquisition. Land acquisition was funded at $301 million in the current fiscal year. The President had requested $900 million for next year. We funded it at $66 million in this bill to complete land acquisitions currently under consideration. I would personally like to see more funding in the LWCF. The problem is we just don't have the money. It's also worth noting that while we increase funding for oil and gas rig inspections, we don't pay for them by including the President's proposed $38 million increase for additional onshore gas and oil fees or the $55 million increase for additional offshore oil and gas fees. These issues are best left to the authorizing committees of jurisdiction, and I hope that by next year the authorizing committees will address this issue. There are a few other items that may be of interest to members that I'll mention briefly. The U.S. Geological Survey is funded at $1.1 billion, which is $30 million or 3% below the FY11 enacted level. The Next Generation Landsat Satellite Imaging Program, which has been a cooperative venture with NASA, was proposed to be transferred entirely to the USGS without any corresponding funding from NASA. Because the projected costs are estimated to increase tenfold over the next 2 years, and because Landsat is a widely used governmental and private sector resource, this bill sends the proposal back to the administration with instructions to start over. Within the EPA, the bill includes $15 million for a new competitive grant program to fund rural water technical assistance, which is widely supported on both sides of the aisle. The NEA and the NEH are both funded at $135 million, which is a level too low for some members and too high for others. It's worth noting that both sides work together in an effort to maintain several long-standing, proven programs that the administration had slated for termination. The bill provides funding for the Smithsonian at levels just below the FY11 enacted level and includes $50 million to begin construction of the National Museum of African American History and Culture and $75 million for revitalization of existing Smithsonian buildings. The bill also provides a $30 million down payment to begin construction next year of a memorial to honor the memory of Dwight D. Eisenhower. I suspect that most of the headlines from the House consideration of this bill will focus on the committee's attempts and its attention to the EPA. We need to continue funding the EPA in order for business to obtain the necessary permits to operate in accord with the environmental laws. Through EPA funding, we also continue to address our nation's critical water and wastewater infrastructure needs. However, one of the major underlying themes in this year's work is the sheer volume of the regulatory actions being pursued by agencies in the absence of legislation and without clear congressional direction. My intense opposition to the EPA's efforts to control nearly every industry in this country is no secret. The EPA's unrestrained effort to regulate greenhouse gases and the pursuit of an overly aggressive regulatory agenda are signs of an agency that has lost its bearing. Wherever I go, the biggest complaint I hear about the federal government is about how the EPA is creating economic uncertainty and killing jobs. This isn't a partisan issue. Members of both parties have said that the EPA's regulatory actions vastly exceed its authority and the congressional intent. The responsibility to determine whether or not to expand that authority rests solely with Congress, not with the EPA. We have included a number of provisions in the base bill to address some of these issues, and more were added in full committee. We saw during consideration of H.R. 1 earlier this year, and we will see again on the House floor, even more efforts to rein in the EPA. I know some of my Democrat friends will be especially critical of the spending reductions in the EPA accounts. While we all recognize the importance of the Clean Drinking Water and Safe Drinking Water State Revolving Funds, we also know that funding them, as we have in the past, is not possible. We need to find a better long-term funding source for water infrastructure projects, something that a number of members have been working on. It's also worth pointing out that these accounts received $6 billion in Recovery Act funds in 2009 and still have nearly $3 billion in previously appropriated funds that they have yet to spend. In calendar year 2009, the EPA received over $25 billion in combined stimulus funding and regular appropriations, so it should come as no surprise that the funding for the EPA was reduced by $1.5 billion, or 18% from current levels. Much will be said today about the subcommittee's allocation and the policy provisions in this bill, but just remember, at the end of the day, what this committee is attempting to do is all about reducing spending, creating more certainty in the marketplace, and promoting an economic environment conducive to job growth. If there's one thing that we should have learned in the last couple of years, it's that we can't spend our way to an economic recovery. That didn't work. All it did was make the hole we're in much deeper. I know Mr. Moran and Mr. Dix may not agree, but the legislative provisions in this bill and those that will be added today and on the House floor, they aren't about special interests. They're about jobs. They're about protecting businesses and hardworking Americans from frivolous lawsuits. They're about creating certainty in the marketplace. And they're about assuring businesses that employ people that it's safe to begin hiring people again without the threat of the EPA, under the guise of protecting our environment, imposing millions of dollars of penalties through regulations that are unreasonable or simply defy common sense. Is this a perfect bill? No, but I've never seen a perfect bill. This is a bill that makes some very tough choices on spending. It's a bill that attempts to rein in the excesses of the EPA, and it's a bill that sends a clear message to stakeholders in Congress that it's time to get busy on renewing expiring authorizations. I wish we had more money to spend on a variety of programs that I and other members believe are important. I also wish we didn't have a $1.6 trillion deficit. I wish we weren't $14.5 trillion in debt. I wish the economy was booming and that unemployment was something we only read about in history books. Unfortunately, wishing doesn't make it so. These are the economic and political realities that we have to face. In closing, I'd like to thank the staff on both sides of the aisle for their hard work in producing this bill. Most members don't. On the minority side, I'd like to thank Rick Healy and Shalanda Young, as well as Tim Aiken and Pete Modoff. They played an integral role in the process, and their efforts are very much appreciated. On the majority side, I'd like to thank the subcommittee staff, Colin Vickery, Grace Stevens, who, by the way, just had a baby last week. She held off until she was sure we had this bill through the full committee. Erica Rhodes, Jason Day, Darren Benjamin, Dave Lestrange. I'd also like to thank Missy Small, Kaylin Bessie, and Lindsay Slater on my personal staff for their great work. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Idaho reserves his time. The gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Moran, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, this is a sad day. A sad day for the environment and for America's great natural and cultural heritage. H.R. 2584, with its deep cuts in important environmental and natural resource programs, an amazing array of special interest riders and funding limitations, falls far short of meeting our responsibilities to protect and wisely use our nation's natural resources. The bill before the House today is more than $2 billion below the current spending level, and it's almost $4 billion below the President's request. It's even $324 million below the level of H.R. 1 that was passed by the House just in February. Given the subcommittee's punishingly low 302B allocation, I do recognize the difficulties that Chairman Simpson of the subcommittee and Chairman Rogers of the full committee and their excellent staff faced in crafting the bill. I do appreciate his efforts, Mr. Simpson's efforts particularly, and Mr. Cole's, to protect funding for American Indian programs. I only wish that that protection could have extended to other important portions of this bill. But as bad as the funding in this bill is, what is most disappointing is the scope and extent to which the majority has filled this bill with extremist legislative riders and funding limitations. The bill is short on needed funds and long on anti-environmental riders. H.R. 2584 is not so much a spending bill as a wish list for special interests. Oil companies, cattle grazers, industrial agribusiness, miners, and those who wish to pollute our air and water for greater profit all have their special provisions tucked away into this bill. It is a dump truck of provisions for special interests. In addition, this bill picks up where H.R. 1 left off and includes dozens of deep cuts in conservation and environmental protection programs, while the extractive or consumptive uses of our public lands are shielded from cuts and given a pass from complying with our nation's landmark environmental laws. We continually hear from the majority that the pain of budget cuts has to be shared by all. But in this bill, they have chosen winners and losers. The extractors and the exploiters and the despoilers of the forests and the animals and the people who depend upon clean air and water. They have chosen winners and losers. The former are the winners, the latter are the losers. The animals, the environment, the forests, the waterways, they all lose. This bill continues the majority's assault on the Environmental Protection Agency with deep cuts. After the EPA budget was cut by 16% in the current fiscal year, the majority is now proposing a further reduction of 18% for next year. In other words, a 34% cut in environmental protection. Cuts of nearly 40% are made to the Clean Water and Safe Drinking Water grant programs, just at the time when the states and localities have run out of money to try to provide for clean water and to deal with stormwater overflow and all of the infrastructure that is necessary throughout our country. When the majority says it wants to rein in the EPA, what they're really reining in is the ability to protect clean air and clean water. I'm extremely disappointed at the majority's decision to prohibit funds for the Endangered Species Act listing and critical habitat designations. These are the vital first steps needed to begin the recovery process for 260 species currently at risk of extinction. Under the guise of sending a signal to the authorizing committee, this bill attacks the very heart of the Endangered Species Act. Wildlife programs overall are hard hit by this bill. State and tribal wildlife grants are cut by 2/3. Multinational species conservation by 1/5. Cooperative endangered species conservation by 95%. Even funding for the National Wildlife Refuge System will be cut by 7.5%. Our national parks and forests, wildlife refuges, wilderness areas, and other conservation units deserve better than what this bill provides. As stewards of these magnificent resources that were passed down to us, we have a responsibility to defend and preserve them for future generations. Spending reductions like the 78% cut to the Land and Water Conservation Fund, nearly 80% cut to the Land and Water Conservation Fund to the lowest level it's ever been, and the 33% cut to the National Landscape Conservation System will place at risk some of our most precious resources. I'd also like to note that this bill is about more than our natural resources and the environment. And while the cultural activities and institutions are a small portion of the bill, they're a vital part of our communities. They do enhance our economy and our way of life. Yet these programs and activities would receive substantial cuts under this bill as well. I'm also struck by the contradictions contained in H.R. 2584. Here are just two examples. On the one hand, the bill allocates millions of dollars to restore the Everglades in Florida. Yet the majority includes a funding limitation that will permit the pollution of the Everglades. The bill also includes funding to deal with the continuing fallout from uranium mining on the Navajo Indian Reservation. Yet it includes language that will expose the Grand Canyon National Park and the millions of Americans who depend upon the Colorado River for their drinking water to the well-known dangers of uranium mining. And they give away the publicly owned uranium to a foreign-owned Asian mining company. I appreciate the gentleman's comment. Imagine giving away publicly owned uranium, giving it away to a foreign firm. The list of legislative riders and funding limitations in the bill is long. NEPA waivers, limitations on judicial review, blocking of air and water pollution controls. Whole legislative texts have been dumped into this bill. These riders and limitations have nothing to do with deficit reduction and everything to do with carrying out an extreme ideological agenda. Repealing environmental regulations doesn't save money, it costs money. Keeping toxins out of our air and water is a great deal cheaper than cleaning up the damage or dealing with the adverse health effects. Preventing the Deepwater Horizon disaster would have been far cheaper than having to clean it up after the fact. Each rider or funding limitation seems designed to benefit one industry or another. These provisions have become the new earmarks, with 39 such provisions already in the bill, and more are going to be proposed to be added. While this bill rewards businesses and industries that seek to delay or undermine environmental protections, it penalizes others who try to do the right thing. As just one example, American Electric Power recently announced it's going to stop work on a low-carbon coal-fired power plant, carbon sequestration, showing it can work, but they're going to stop work on it in light of the pullback in regulating emissions related to climate change. They see what the Congress is doing, they see what their competitors are doing, so they decided not to do the right thing because we're making it too expensive to do the right thing. With the funding cuts and special interest provisions, it's no wonder that the Statement of Administration Policy on H.R. 2584 runs 5 pages with its veto threat. I concur with the administration's views on the bill, and under general leave will submit the administration's statement. We owe it to our constituents and our communities to protect the air we breathe and the water we drink, to protect public health from the dangers of mercury and arsenic and lead. Imagine we have more than 500 coal-fired power plants in this country, and they emit more than 78,000 pounds of mercury, and yet one drop of mercury will poison an entire lake. That's what we should be looking to, and not tying EPA's hands. We ought to be good stewards of the abundant natural and cultural heritage passed down to us. President Johnson noted in 1964, and I'm going to quote, "If future generations are to remind us and remember us with gratitude rather than contempt, we must leave them something more than the miracles of technology. We should be leaving them a glimpse of the world as it was in the beginning, not just after we got through with it." Mr. Chairman, H.R. 2584 falls far short of our responsibilities to present and future generations, and so I obviously oppose the bill, and I'll reserve the balance of my time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman